Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome on this, depending on where you are, cold or somewhat cold afternoon. We are going to be talking about maintaining your Tier 2 systems today. And before we get started, as people are coming in the room, I am going to put up a poll for us. And if you don't mind indicating your role or position in the district for us, that would be wonderful. Welcome again. And I'm going to ask Betsy to go ahead and chat in the link for us for the handouts for today. We're glad you were all able to join Stephanie, I, and Betsy today for this chat. We are going to focus on the guiding principles of our PBIS framework, but of course geared towards our Tier 2 system. And when you look at the guiding principles that are up on the screen now, we know that our PBIS framework is a multi-tiered framework with a system of supports. The other bullets that you see there are true for all of those layers of support. So whether we're talking about Tier 1 systems, Tier 2, or Tier 3 systems, those bullets of evidence-based instruction and intervention, that critical feature of teaching and then reinforcing what we've taught for behaviors, using data to problem solve, frequent progress monitoring, and are all consistent features of all levels. So we're going to focus in on that Tier 2 level today. But when we talk about PBIS as a framework, it's just important that we remind that it's across all 3 tiers with these guiding principles. And that when our goal of these 3 tiers working together is overall to increase or enhance social, emotional, and behavioral outcomes for all. So with that being said, the title of today was around maintaining a Tier 2 system. So as we dive into that topic, we wanted to hear, and I know we're kind of a small but mighty group today, just in the chat box, if you don't mind chatting out in your district, or if you're representing a school team, for your Tier 2 system, what do you like or think is going well with your Tier 2 system, or what would you like to improve? So 2 questions for you. I'm going to give you a second to chat. Just get us warmed up using that chat box. In your district or school, what's something you really like or think is going well about Tier 2 system, or what's something you'd like to improve? And I didn't have the chat up. If you could let me know, Betsy or Stephanie, if any items are coming up in the chat box, I'm going to fix it so I can see it.
Nothing yet. Oh, here we go. Stephanie in Escambia said, like our small group counseling and our SEL program, Suite 360.
Perfect. Thanks, Betsy. I just got it up. So thanks, Stephanie. I saw that. You want to improve your check-in, check-out implementation. Okay, great. Thanks, Stephanie, for being our first brave one to put out in the chat box. Other district representatives or school, if you're from a school representative, no right or wrong answers here. Just what's something that you really like or think is going well in your Tier 2 system, or something you'd like to improve. So Stephanie started us off there from Escambia. Thank you. Thanks, Gregory. So Gregory had said, love major improvements as it relates to monitoring progress and combining systems with our district to streamline. Great. Thanks for that, Gregory. Hi, Erica. Thank you. So in Duval, we created a mainstreamed MTSS process. They've done a huge revamp there, which is awesome, using their focused data system for forms and process. And they're normed all the way across, which they are a massive district. So that's a huge success. Thanks, Erica. Okay, thanks for those who have been brave enough to chat in the chat box. We're going to do a poll a little bit later, but just please continue to chat in things that you think are going really well, or areas that you'd like to improve as we go through content today. My computer is tired today. It's not wanting to behave. There we go. So as far as, again, that topic being maintaining our Tier 2 system. One of the reasons I just asked the question I did was everyone has features of Tier 2 in place in their schools and districts, but sometimes we see certain parts are going better and some parts are areas where we're focusing on to improve. And in that we're going off the maintenance part here, not the initial training of it. These are our recommendations to you as a district or a school-based leader on how you'd maintain your Tier 2 system. We're going to unpack these recommendations today, but the first being revisit those Tier 1 vital features. The multi-tiered system is only powerful if those tiers work together and build on one another. So revisiting Tier 1 becomes very important for Tier 2. Stephanie and myself will take you through a couple things around identifying and using decision rules, in particular those around recommended interventions with evidence-based considerations around them, and using consistent progress monitoring practices and data systems. And last but not least, that continuous improvement model, is it working, is what we have in place for our system working. On the right-hand side is a newer visual. It's pretty recent that we made it gorgeous. If you saw an older version of it, it wasn't as pretty as you see on the right-hand side. But that visual is in your handouts, and the link that Betsy had shared gives a nice one-page snapshot of the full 2-day training that we do with school teams on setting up your Tier 2 system, and is a nice reminder for staff already implementing Tier 2 of those critical features. And again, we're going to unpack those with some of the recommendations on the left today. So that handouts on the right is in the handouts for you, and we're going to move forward with unpacking some. So the first recommendation was revisiting Tier 1 vital features. So at the top of that handout, you saw ensuring Tier 1 access. We have to make sure that we know what are those critical features of Tier 1 that kids have access to, so that when we build on it in Tier 2 and 3, it's successful. I always give the example of reading, because most educators, that makes perfect sense. If we tried to intervene on reading without giving them core reading instruction, Tier 2 or 3 would never work. Same happens with behavioral or social emotional skills. And the ensuring Tier 1 access, you see 2 bullets underneath there. Those are kind of the bare bones of school-wide PBIS that should be in place. The bare minimum I would consider as far as Tier 1 access. But instruction being the most important feature, have students received instruction on school-wide and classroom expectations, rules, procedures. The second piece of that being the reinforcement. And those of you who've been doing this a long time find that sometimes schools run into this habit of only doing reinforcement without the instruction. And we know it only works and is powerful if we've done the instruction and then reinforce. So keeping those mutually together, and as that critical piece of Tier 1 access. So as you see on the right, there's your multi-tiered systems stacking on top of each other. So when we build on Tier 2, we're going to be building on that Tier 1 foundation of instruction and that relationship piece of reinforcement. Why that's so critical and why it's our number one recommendation is, of course, we've already mentioned, and people, we say this over and over again in training when we train with teams, it's going to be critical that your Tier 1 is successful to make Tier 2 and Tier 3 successful. Not to mention Tier 2 is going to be additional or supplemental. So you're going to have additional resources involved, room and a schedule. You're going to have resources such as adults, curriculums, or adult time in a schedule to provide that. So if we're doing supplemental, we want to make sure that we're being working smarter, not harder, and ensuring that effective Tier 1 as to not put the strain on those additional resources, excuse me. This is one of the slides from our Tier 2 training. And just to mention that, again, why it was our number one recommendation for you, the Tier 2 critical features build on that piece of our core curriculum. So if I'm a school that's implementing school-wide PBS, I want to make sure I'm strong in that school-wide instruction and classroom, and I'll touch on classroom in just a second. And then the rest of the flow chart on here can work really well in Tier 2. If that first critical feature is missing, it doesn't flow so well, even in real life when you're doing this at the school level. And we will talk a lot about decision rules today, because they are another critical feature to make this go well, or as some of you were saying in the examples, to be consistent in the way we implement something across a district or across a school campus. So critical features listed out, number one being building on that Tier 1. And we're going to unpack some of the predetermined decision rules that you see there today, as well as some of the pieces about monitoring implementation fidelity. So a lot of our districts and schools in their MTSS framework and process and procedures will go a step further than just those bare minimum Tier 1 and really highlight some of those big 5 classroom practices as part of our essential Tier 1 that kids should access. We know classroom practices are a really important piece to contribute to positive student outcomes. And it's also really challenging on a school campus to get our classroom level performance consistent, especially in Florida, and then we have a lot of really large schools. So when you look on this visual, if you are not familiar with the classroom Big 5, they are over on your right for you, straight off our webpage that is at the top of that link. But in addition to the 2 already mentioned in our flow chart about teaching those expectations and routines and rules and the rules and routines and procedures. There we go. You're also considering the structure and creating that structure for effective classrooms, that active engagement and instruction, and that acknowledgement, that those effective responses to problem behavior. So that's a visual, just a quick reminder to you of the big five. This was also our reminder that if you haven't seen them and are kind of revisiting tier one features, the classroom tip sheets were just recently, I say recently, it was probably about 2 months ago, the tip sheets were created that kind of give you a nice little check sheet or self-monitoring, a way to self-assess or observe within each of these big five. So that link is also there for you and a really nice reference for tier one critical features. And Stephanie, I think I'm handing it to you here.
Yes, you are. Thank you, Kat.
Sure.
So once a school has really determined, yes, there's a good tier one system in place and the students are accessing it, then the first thing we want to really consider are who are the students that might need some tier two supports. And so on here, just thinking about, what are some of those decision rules? How are you going to identify? And then making sure that's a structured process that happens 2 to 3 times a year. So as I'm talking to schools now and districts now, I just want to remind them, if you haven't already done a screening process for the 2020-2021 school year, it's a great time to get this in place to identify who are the students. And remember, there should be multiple sources of data that are used, and the data should make sure that it identifies students who have both internalizing behaviors and externalizing behaviors. On the right side of the screen, it shows where you can find some more information for identifying students on our website. So here is an example of what Monroe County has done and offers for the schools in the school district. And so they just first start with a reminder that, again, first thing we want to check is, do we have an effective core, and a reminder of that. Then they break that down and they start to have some data sources, recommendations here of how to identify if students are receiving tier one supports and they're accessing them. You'll notice in here, they have district-wide adopted 2 SEL programs. And so that's built in with Second Step for K through 8. And it was Project Wisdom for secondary, so 9th through 12th grade. And then after they've done that and they've assessed, then they start to think about, okay, who are the students who are not being successful with just tier one supports? And so here's some of the documentation that they ask their schools to identify and some different data sources to look at to help them identify whether they really do need tier one supports only or tier two supports.
And this is a Marion County example, which is not a district I have the pleasure of supporting, but they were nice enough to share. And they have led this initiative, a revamp, a couple of you were mentioning revamp of their processes. They've recently done a lot of work in the district revamping their process through their school psychologist leads. It's been a work group across the district through student support services leadership and some of the school psychologists. And there's been 4 critical school psychologists that I know of that have been leading this process along with their ongoing feedback from that work group. They've been using their forums to kind of guide teams. Some of it's process and procedure, but some of it also gives some scaffolded guidance to make those decisions. So the example that's up on the screen right now is that tier one decision about implementation. So if our number one recommendation to start with was revisit those tier one features, in their process, they've made that kind of scaffolded as far as what areas need to be improved upon or what might require training or retraining. So they put some percentages there, like remember those bare minimums we talked about. They have the 3-5 school-wide expectations are posted and taught. I like that they put those together, not just posted, but they're posted and taught. And they're looking at the percentage of classrooms that's present. So it was a nice way to look at that tier one feature, have teams consider that as a tier one core feature, along with what level of our campus is exemplifying this trait. And then that classroom management system, remember the big 5 classroom that I hit on? Some districts have various classroom management structures they use, like a CHAMPS or a STOIC or other classroom management systems or trainings. Going with that PBIS framework, is that in place? And in what percentage of classrooms and aligned to the school-wide expectations? Then as Stephanie was just mentioning with Monroe, a lot of our districts have social emotional learning curriculums they're integrating and supplementing with. So some districts, like Marion's example here, might include that as a foundational feature of Tier 1. So not only are we teaching expectations, rules, and routine, but we're providing the agreed upon social emotional learning lessons or curriculum pieces that we've agreed on as a district or school. And then they start to go after that, and we'll show another example. We're going to continue throughout to show examples from various counties, but Marion will show a couple in Monroe as well throughout. They address the piece about addressing major and minor disciplinary offenses as part of that effective discipline side of PBIS framework. But they start to end this with what percentage of kids are getting 2 or more discipline referrals. So in that we just gave some prompts or discussions to guide teams on how's our Tier 1 doing. They're then going to start to look at one area, and they're going to do it with a little bit more data in another example. How many kids are we referring based on that indicator, and is it a Tier 1 or 2 issue? And you see in gray there, they have that anticipated percentage to guide them as well. Like I said, we'll revisit a couple examples from there.
And then the second part of this, or one of my favorite parts, is that when we start talking about Tier 2, Day 2 in our training, that's when we ask the schools to come back and bring some of the data that they've collected and then use that data to start to make some decision rules. And so those decision rules are on lots of different things. So at what point do we identify a student that does need Tier 2 supports using multiple types of data? And so that is brought with them, and they do that and revisit that using the data to help determine what the possible function of the behavior is so that we can match them to interventions that are likely to have greater success. And so using this data here to come up with some decision rules.
And really quickly, I'm going to put up a poll here. So as Stephanie was just showing you, and we're diving into this piece of the visual, in your Tier 2 systems, and you have 3 choices there, or you can indicate multiple. Do you use grade or class nomination forms or existing data, teacher referrals being in existing data, or do you use a standardized universal social emotional screening tool? So again, you should be able to indicate multiple answers there in case you use multiple. We're just trying to get a gauge on what kind of information you use to identify students. Okay, great. So it looks like at least 83% of you use existing data, being any of those examples, which is very common. And then we have 43% use grade or class nominations. That was 3 out of 7 of the districts represented or schools. And then we had 2 of you that mentioned standardized universal social emotional screening tools. All right, so we have a nice representation of different types of sources, with existing being the, and let me share results with you, sorry. There we go. So now you can see some of the data I was just reading to you as far as the representation. That's pretty typical. What Stephanie and I see when we train with teams, people usually almost always have existing data as one way they can refer. The other 2 are getting at your internalizers and not as common. So this little small sample kind of represents what we see mostly across our district. And Stephanie, I'm going to stop sharing so you can keep going.
So then we need to provide a rationale of why we need to decision rules. So our decision rules help us make some determinations on whether or not a student needs more intensive support, so more than just one. The decision rules also help us to identify if the student is making progress or not once they are receiving Tier 2 supports. And then the decision rules help us to determine what to do next if the student's having success, if they're not having success, or if they're having questionable success. So the team should be using the data on a regular basis to decide the next steps for students. And here's some other decision rules that might come up. So what makes success for a student? At our school, based on our data, maybe it's a student who on their daily progress report has received 80% of their points for 5 consecutive days across 2 weeks. or it could be something even greater. It could be if they're meeting their goal, whatever their goal may be, 10 out of 12 days. And then that way it helps us to determine if they're being successful or not, and helps us to decide what to do next. It also helps us to decide if a student is not being successful with their tier 2 interventions. And maybe it helps us to decide, do we change the tier 2 intervention? Do we modify the tier 2 intervention? Or maybe the student needs more than one intervention, but we should use our data to decide and guide those things. So a common example may be you might have a student who's receiving check-in, check-out supports. You thought the function of their behavior was they liked adult attention. You started to provide check-in, check-out for the student. However, what you've noticed is during the time that they've been receiving check-in, check-out, they've received 3 referrals for aggressive behavior. We know that check-in, check-out, or BEP, is not recommended for students who have aggressive behavior who are trying to escape. So we then decide maybe this is not the best fit for the student, and we go back to the drawing board and decide what might be a better fit for that specific student. Maybe we have another student who is not doing well with check-in and check-out. And what we're discovering is they check in great in the morning, but they're forgetting to check out in the afternoon. So maybe what we do is just a modification to it, and they have a buddy that picks them up and brings them for check-in, check-out. And then we also use that for fading. But the decision rules are those data that should be used during our problem-solving meetings to determine which students need support, how their support is going, and what the next steps will be.
So to what Stephanie was just reviewing is around what are decision rules, because that was one of our recommendations, and we said we'd go through 2 types. Decision rules are pretty critical to consistency and being fluent in your process. So I bring up an example here from Nassau County, and this is their early warning indicators. And I bring up theirs because lots of districts have early warning indicators. In fact, most districts at least have those bare minimum of the middle school statute required ones. But I know many districts have a similar type of chart. I just brought up Nassau as an example. They developed by their district team to each grade level. So this is 3rd through 5th. They also have a K through 2, a middle school and a high school. Just on the screen is 3 through 5. I bring up the indicators because this is a way they use existing data, like others that use the early warning system and how it's intended to predict risk and also to look at health of core. So if you're familiar with early warning indicators, it goes off of some critical features for academics. That'd be their course performance here. Attendance being an early warning indicator. We know attendance as early as preschool can predict graduation success. Discipline, which has more literature to support us in secondary, but in elementary, they want to incorporate an indicator of discipline. And then usually standardized test performance or assessments is referred to here. Now, they also incorporated a social emotional column in their indicators. That's not as common in districts because there's not as much research to guide us in early warning systems. But I'll talk a little bit about that and how they use this data. One of the reasons this example is here is this is a nice decision rule the district has to be common ways of looking at multiple data sources for what's on track, what's at risk, what's off track, and extremely off track. So they've set up their own decision rules as far as what indicators indicate I'm on performance or on target, on track, versus at the bottom, what would put me way off track. So almost all of you, I think 83% were indicating you use existing data. This is a way of using existing data with common decision rules for performance. It also helps because I can look at if 50% of my school is off track. That is a tier 1 issue that we at least have to address that tier 1 issue while we intervene as well. We can't intervene with that amount. It can also, so we can indicate a tier 1 issue consistently. It can also help us use decision rules of intensity, like triaging, a form of triaging in schools. So how off track am I and how significant of concern do we have? And discipline, if we just stick with discipline, for example, this is 3rd through 5th. So 0 out of school suspensions, 0 in school suspensions, and there was an error on the one copy in your handout, so I apologize. I want to make sure to note that. And 0 to 1 office discipline referral, that's on track. So as we're starting to get more off track in discipline, that would indicate more behavioral risk for that externalizing measure, that measure of behavior that we can see. So one example that you commonly, probably most of you on the call have, is those early warning indicators that can be used as decision rules for Tier 1 health and also for who should receive interventions. This will also start to take you down a path of what interventions to receive. As Stephanie was going through the flow chart of kind of using existing data to start to look at function. It won't always be the end all be all, but it'll be a start to maybe what the needs are for an intervention. We might have to gather more information if this is all we have. Okay, so that's one example that I thought was common. So Stephanie, excuse me. Another example might be student outcome data. So this is a core report. That was just the early warning indicators that you saw as one example. The core report is one you're probably familiar with from, at the bare minimum, the annual outcome data you get in PBIS from us. But there's a already applied decision rule to that core data that you see. So where you see 72%, that is green because it's the percentage of population that's only gotten 0 to 1 referrals on a campus. 18% would be 2 to 6 referrals, 10% being 6 or more. So that student outcome data measure is another common decision rules that schools might use. If you use RTIB, our data system, you can look at that data at any time to be a decision rule. So we're going to use data not only to decide who gets interventions, but as Stephanie was just walking through, for each intervention on our campus, we wanted to also use it to decide the 3 boxes you see at the very end of this flow chart. Who's going to need more intensity or more help, who might need some more time at Tier 2 until that goal is met, and who really doesn't need Tier 2 support and can fade back or graduate from that. So those are critical pieces of decision rules: who's going to get and who's going to stay at Tier 2, get more intensive, or fade out. And we'll give some examples of those. We always reference this slide in our Tier 2 training. I always bring it up because it is a great way to guide if you are a district revamping your process, 1. 2, if you're a school leader and looking at setting up your system for the school year, or even trying to make improvements after we come back from holiday break. These guiding questions are good to help you set up that system. We don't want you to be making these decisions child by child by child. The idea of the system is these are already predetermined and decided. So you've already heard a lot of them referenced from Stephanie and I, but this just gives you a 1-pager of what decision rules we need to attend to and what should we predetermine. For example, what's the goal of each intervention? A lot of times our teams will start to decide not only the goal, like a percentage of points on a daily behavior report card, but how long students have to maintain that goal. So 3 consecutive weeks at 80%, for example. Getting really hardcore and concrete with that goal is going to help us be a little more consistent in using it with students. So I encourage you, flag it, use it as far as schools, or if you're a part of the district process revamp, like some of these that we've been showing you, we'll continue to show you. These can help you in what to attend to that needs to be predetermined. So I already gave you a couple from using early warning system. This is just another example for you for reference. If it helps, sometimes people like this more than the early warning system indicator, but we use it in our Tier 2 training to show the same idea, but how they take existing data and put decision rules to it. So we define what's proficient or on track, what's at risk or high risk. This is a lot to me of existing data. You wouldn't have to necessarily have 9 indicators, just this example does. So in your schools or district, you could maybe only have 4 or 5, just trying to balance that we have behavioral with other types of data like the academic that is also there. One of the reasons we encourage you to think about not just behavioral data, but academic is for the working smarter, not harder again. And when you think about grouping kids by common needs. So just like we group kids for academic interventions within similar instructional needs, on a campus, we want to be able to group them by common behavioral instruction needs or social emotional skill instruction needs. So if I have a group of students who needs more coping skills or handling frustration or emotion management, that's a group of instructional needs that are common. In the middle, and this is a really common group in schools, if we have kids who are academically behind or have academic deficits, we know that's going to go hand in hand with frustration and task avoidance. So we want to intervene on that academic deficit, But in those academic interventions, we'll probably like sprinkle or put some, I could call it sprinkling, but a little strategies on managing frustration and help with behavioral strategies for avoidance. We wouldn't start a whole nother intervention in most cases. We just, for those groups of kids that we're academically intervening in, we'd add in that behavioral piece. The last way to think of this is functions. Now, functions and similar instruction needs often go hand in hand, just language. Sometimes people like to think of function and sometimes we like to think of instructional needs. And that's very clear in that flowchart visual that we said, but looking at, are these kids with avoidance or trying to get away from something? Or are these kids with attention seeking or trying to obtain or get activity or attention again of adults or peer? And Stephanie already gave some nice examples of that with grouping. If they're attention seeking, we know a behavior education program, a check-in, check-out is a really nice matched intervention. So when we look at existing data, we like to be able to group as much as possible by common needs. That helps us out a lot in schools with resources. And we just referenced our tier 2 spreadsheet to take this idea a little bit further. I call it the old school Excel sheet, but if you haven't seen it, we show it in tier 2 training. It's going to be in that list of live binders. We also put that link at the end of the presentation for you. But there's a tab where if I'm a school person, like a school counselor or a school support staff member, where I am tracking all the kids referred for tier 2, it allows me to group or just manually indicate what function is perceived for the students. And that idea of academic supports with behavior reports. So it's just a pretty easy Excel tool you can use for that. We are moving into tier 2 selection. So we also have always referenced our check sheet for you to consider. You don't need to have a huge plethora. It's not like a buffet of interventions. You just want to have those couple that are power hitters for those instructional needs, like the social emotional skill instruction, the behavior education check-in, check-out program. We'd want to have some of those key features. So if you think of your interventions that are available on your campus or in your district, that check sheet's a nice tool to look at. And that takes us right into some of those, revisiting those examples we mentioned. So this is Marion County again. They come back to, remember they had that little guiding document before about what percentage are actually demonstrating some of those critical features of tier 1. They're going now into a decision rule about who can stay at that tier 1, which is who might need that tier 2 level of support. Now they indicate a couple of things here. In ODRs, they're looking at receiving 2 or more. They are also thinking about the classroom those students come from as a decision rule here. Because we know if we take them out of classrooms that are having more referrals or more ODRs and put them back in those environments, tier 2 won't be as successful. It also referenced their early warning indicators. So it's incorporating their data in the district. And this is a district process for Marion to be decision rules for the school teams. And then you'll see the BEST. They use the BEST social emotional screener. It's a universal social emotional screener. It's a pretty strong tool. Has a lot of good validity and reliability to it. So it's going to look for, and they only use it from my understanding in elementary school. So at elementary school, they can use that BEST screening data to look at internalizing needs. So you see they incorporate that decision rule. Another example from Marion that moves on from that is they give them, and I know this is a little bit busy, but we wanted to reference, because it's lots of information, after going through the decisions of referral. When I talk about grouping by common needs, this is the scaffolding of the guidance they provide to their teams of indicating how we're going to group students who are referred. So on the right, you see a snippet that has kind of starting to look at what areas of concern, and they reference their screener. If you do use a social emotional screener, it's going to give you a lot of information on that. And then they also talk about their multidisciplinary team referral. So using that behavior to kind of start to group and get some idea of the behavior. On the right-hand side, you see they also set up some of those data sources with identified district supported interventions. So in this district, they have identified interventions that are in most cases evidence-based and fit their groups and that match those criteria or data system needs. So again, their process was informed to guide teams and scaffold it. The district decision rules they given here are going to help teams not have to think through each kid, but think through in a group or system approach. So you have these slides. We put them in a PDF a little bit bigger so you could take a little bit closer look to that. But that's the reason we included this particular example. And then Erica, I know you're on from Duval. They also use a universal social emotional screener, and this is the BIMAS. So I know some of you don't have those in your district, but just giving a couple of different examples. They use these in targeted transition grades. So in those grades, they have some additional data they can use to look at internalizing need as well as externalizing. The screener looks at both, as does the BEST that we just saw in Marion's example. They have on the right a nice guided tool for teams. That's a district decided guidance tool that allows them to look by results of that screener, some scaffolded directions towards interventions or assessments, because sometimes we know assessments will help inform intervention, like a functional behavior assessment informs a behavior intervention plan. So another example, but a little bit different because they have a screener of district guidance or decision around how to use that assessment to then inform intervention at tier 2. I know also tier 3 is on here, but also for tier 2. So that's one example briefly of a couple of districts that use screeners. And then Stephanie, I know you have one from Monroe.
Yes, and this is Monroe's. It lists here some behaviors to consider for and data sources to look at when considering for students who might need tier 2 supports. They are starting to go the route of what Kat just showed with Duval, where they have adopted some screeners for elementary and for secondary students. They actually just did their first round of screening, and so they're looking at that data right now. And I bet they will be adding to this tier 2 decision guide some suggestions based on the data they just collected for those screeners for students. So forthcoming. And then here they also include what to do as far as interventions and the next steps after they have identified students who might need tier 2 supports. So here's another decision rule. And we've kind of alluded to this already. Once we identify who the students are that need tier 2 supports, and we identify their perceived function of behavior, we then need to match them to interventions that will address their specific needs. And so here's just a sample of a school that said these are the different needs of the students, and then these are the different tier 2 services that we can provide to meet their needs. You may sometimes find that after you've done this and you've identified the needs of the student, you may not actually have a tier 2 support that matches the needs of the student. If that's the case, then you'll have to look and see, okay, what would be something that would meet the needs of the students? And that's where maybe that other category fits in. We know a lot of schools like to start with check-in, check-out for the majority of students, but we will find that it doesn't work for all. There are some criteria of avoiding adult attention or escape that it's not indicated for. So when that happens, we need to think, okay, what else can we offer and what meets the needs of the students? We also need to figure a lot of times that we don't identify things for students who have internalizing behavior. And so we need to identify what are some of those supports for those students. Then we need to think about the outcomes. So we need to think about, okay, now that we've identified our students, we have matched them to intervention, they are now receiving intervention. We need to figure out, how are the students doing? What data sources are we going to collect to determine if students are meeting their goals? How many days do they have to receive the intervention? How many times do they have to meet their goal? Another big one is, what is their baseline? We want to make sure that when we are collecting progress monitoring data for students, we want something that's realistic. So we know some schools will actually collect baseline data for a week. And then use that to help determine what the baseline goal will be for the students. Then once they have their goal in place, if they're continually meeting their goal, how are we going to increase the goal? So if we have a student like Kat maybe who's starting on a daily progress report for check-in, check-out based on her baseline, she has a goal of 45% of her points daily. At what point do we say, wow, Kat's been successfully meeting her goal, let's increase that? Do we increase it by 5%? Do we increase it by 10%? How are we going to do that? Then we also need to think about if a student's not being successful, they're not meeting their goals, What does that look like? Is it 3 out of 5 days? Is it for over so many weeks? And then how do we know that they're actually receiving the intervention as intended? Maybe at a secondary school, we have a student who's doing check in, check out, and they have 2 teachers who flat out refuse to participate and do their daily progress report. What if we have a student who's not checking in or checking out? What if we are doing a curriculum like skill streaming or Y-Try or second step, and it's being held during lunch on Wednesdays? Well, what if the student's absent every Wednesday? Or what if they miss because they've been assigned lunch detention? Do we honestly know that the student is getting the intervention with Fidelity? And if not, what can we do to increase that fidelity? And that should be some questions we ask ourselves before we decide to either continue, modify, or increase supports. And then if we've determined that the student has been receiving the intervention with Fidelity and they're not consistently meeting their goals, then we need to decide some next steps. Do we need to modify? Do we need to change the intervention? Do we need to do double dose? So some kids may be successful if they get both check in, check out, and some social skills instruction. And then at what point do we say that the tier 2 supports are not enough? We have a student that needs more intensive supports. Then we have here to help out, and I love this because this is a really good breakdown of what BEP or check-in, check-out looks like. This is the process. This can also be used as a way to kind of assess, are we doing the intervention with Fidelity? So it's a great one to keep in mind if check-in, check-out is something that you're doing, and just making sure that this is what your program looks like and you can use it to help assess for fidelity of implementation. We've also mentioned, of course, that we need to make sure that we have a progress monitoring tool. One tool that is really easy to use across tier 2 interventions is a daily progress report. These are aligned to the school-wide expectations. And so here's a sample of it. One of my favorite ones is a school that has this, but it's a middle school and they wanted to make sure that there was consistency. So they actually have a scoring rubric of what 1, 2, and 3 looks like for each of these. Has lots of benefits. Probably the best benefit to this is it's something that the data can be collected quickly and easily by the teacher. And you do have enough data so that you can progress over time and see if there's some changes real quickly. It's sensitive to change. And the bottom right-hand corner is that oldie but goodie tool that Kat was referring to on the Excel spreadsheet that you can collect data with if your district does not have a process for doing that. Here is another example from Monroe County, and this is just some information from them about how to determine if the intervention was implemented with Fidelity. You can see here's the opportunity to identify some data collection on what's the baseline goal for the student, what is the goal, what's the midpoint data, and then what does their data look like.
And so sorry, Stephanie, I just messed your screen up there. I was just trying to reference the middle school example that she said that is a really nice one. It's in our tier 2 live binder. That's the link at the end of the page. I just want to make sure to say that, but I can't chat. I'm sharing my screen apparently. So the other one that I skipped, I'll just go back to quickly. This is again from Nassau County because they just revamped their system, their process and procedures. And the only reason I put this one up here before even the Monroe one was one choice they made that people seem to really like and helps teams is they put together fidelity tracking in terms of number of minutes or pieces of the intervention with their progress monitoring score. So we're going to graph progress monitoring data to be able to make decisions, but just putting that on one sheet was like the simplest thing as far as a revamp, but it really helped the teams to see the connection of we want to monitor fidelity and progress monitoring together. So that's from Nassau, and they're always happy to share their examples. And then I had skipped Marion's just as another piece. We're going over all, like the Monroe one Stephanie had said. They just get that scaffold to make sure we're monitoring progress at consistent intervals, 4 weeks and 8 weeks. And then to monitor it with increase, decrease, or minimal change is another example. So similar to kind of what Monroe was just going over, or what Stephanie just went over with Monroe. Okay, so in our last piece here, the in terms of if you remember when we talk about decision rules, that positive response, questionable response, or poor response, if you hear your teams or in your school, if you hear your school staff saying that they get stuck in the process, or we feel like we never move from decisions, it often comes back to we aren't clear on what's positive, what's questionable, what's poor. Because if we have that predetermined with like the DPR that Stephanie reviewed, for an example, if we know that 80% on that DPR is the goal, and we know that we have to have that 3 weeks in a row to be positive, that's pretty clear on when we're going to fade kids back out as a positive response. Or if they're getting close to 80%, we might continue that intervention with that goal. Questionable is a little bit trickier, but again, if we have it predetermined, we can know when someone's kind of staying at that like stagnant point. They're not really decreasing, but they're not increasing. So we want to make some decisions around fidelity, and if we need to look at fidelity of the intervention as well as increasing intensity in some cases. And we might not have the best match of intervention for those students. So maybe we thought the function was attention, so we put them in a check-in, check-out. But as we gather data with check-in, check-out, we see they have more of an internalizing feature to them, and they may need a social emotional skill group. And then poor response is usually one that stands out. I will tell you, when you're looking at student data, it's usually pretty obvious it's a poor response. And I don't laugh at that. I don't want us to have a poor response, but it is definitely one where we are very clear on it's not going well, and we want to put some changes in place. So again, if it's questionable or poor, we're always looking back at, was it intervention done as intended? Did we get the right match to intervention? Is it matched to that same function or skill need? And do we need to consider something else? So this is, again, that predetermined feature. It was also addressed in that questions slide. I said, gives you a nice snapshot of what you need to determine. But we're at that point of deciding success of interventions. So as a visual example of that last slide, here is an example from our RTIB system. I know lots of you use different systems for data tracking, but with a DPR, it's that same one I've been verbally talking out to you with daily percentage of total points. If their decision rule is 80% of points for 4 to 5 days per week or 3 consecutive weeks, and the blue trend, or excuse me, the blue line going across the graph is that student's performance. The bar graph is office discipline referrals. Do you think this, in the chat box, if you don't mind saying, do you think the student's having a good, questionable, or poor response? There's the goal in the decision rule and the individual student response. So would you say the student's having a good or a questionable or poor response? Okay, everyone's tired at this part of the day. Stephanie, what would you say with this student having a good, questionable, or poor response?
I would say that after some changes, and that's what that red line means, the student seems to be having a positive response to the intervention. I would just question the goal for the student. And how appropriate is 80%. I would personally lower it a little bit more, give the student the opportunity to feel like they're meeting their goal, and then increasing it slowly over time.
Perfect. So as she mentioned, these red lines are the trend change. If I looked at the student on Thursday, 9/15, I would not be feeling pretty good if my goal was 80%. I also don't know if I would feel like they're making great progress. So if I made changes to interventions, which they did, you're definitely seeing a more clear trend upward, but not quite at that 80% yet. So as Stephanie was saying, maybe looking at lowering that goal in terms of performance so they can achieve it, and then looking at increasing it after a certain number of weeks. A lot of our teams do that. So we're going to start with a goal, for example, of 60%. Every 2 weeks, we're going to move that up until we get to that end goal of 80%. So that's just a visual example of applying a decision rule and why graphs are so helpful when you're deciding student response. Our last piece was that little last recommendation we said about, is our system working? So most of you gave great examples of things that you think are going great in your school or district tier 2 systems. Every time we develop a process or procedure, we're always seeing, is it working? And so that's a critical feature that to maintain your system, that continuous improvement model. And big picture wise, we just covered a lot of individual student or even students, individual students receiving interventions. At a systems level, though, we really want to know, are interventions as a whole effective? So not just is Stephanie or Kat responding, but is the group of students receiving check in, check out on our campus, for example, overall, is that intervention effective? Is it working for most of the kids in that intervention? If I'm doing a second step group, is that group overall effective for most of the kids that are in that second step group? Because that's going to help us make a decision about that intervention as a whole as part of, is our system working? It's also going to show us about picking the right intervention. If I see, for example, that check in, check out, we have 15 kids on our campus in check in, check out, and only 2 of them were making positive growth. I'm definitely going to want to explore, 1, are we doing that intervention correctly? And 2, and not as a punitive thing, but is there barriers that have hurt doing the check-ins or check-outs? Is the teacher feedback part not going well? Do we need to problem solve that to get that a little bit tighter or cleaner as the intervention intends? Or is there a different intervention? Maybe we need to revisit function for some of those students. So it's very eye-opening to look at interventions by all kids in that intervention than just looking at individual student response. So that's part of system evaluation. And then in training, when we're training with school teams, and it's in our Tier 2 Live Finder that we keep referencing for you, that's that same link. This is a simple chart that school, at the bare minimum, just an easy chart of looking at that idea of whole interventions. And then Stephanie's going to show, as far as a Marion County example, how they monitor that electronically. But just looking at each intervention, how many kids are in that intervention and how many are actually responding. With, again, that idea of, to know how many kids are responding, we have to know what that goal is. That's at the bottom. That's what that blue arrow is, that decision rule of what is our goal for success of those interventions. If we don't know the goal, we can't answer how many kids are responding. So Stephanie, you want to talk about this one?
Sure. Like most school districts, Monroe's district data system doesn't have a feature in to track how students are doing for Tier 2 for behavioral success. So a simple solution. They came up with a survey in Qualtrics. Qualtrics is a system kind of like SurveyMonkey. You could also do it in like Google Docs or Google Forms. And so essentially each school just puts the student name, what month it is, which school they're from, the grade level of the student, and then they let the school, then they identify based on their decision points how the student is responding to the Tier 2 interventions. Are they having a positive response, a questionable response, or a negative response? What this allows the school and the school district to do is then by each school, they'll know how many students are receiving the Tier 2 supports for behavior. They will be able to do some disaggregating data by grade level. They'll be able to identify how many students are having a positive response for each school, how many are having a questionable, how many are having negative. And it also lets them know too, how many students are receiving Tier 2 behavioral supports for externalizing behaviors and how many students are receiving supports for Tier 2 for internalizing behaviors and how they are responding to their interventions. So an easy, simple solution when you don't have a data system in your district that allows you to collect this information already.
Awesome, thanks. So that was a nice example of the system. I'm just going to quickly reference, because we tried to give you several from those 2 continuously throughout. They do the same idea, same idea, I can't talk today, with their forms that are scaffolding for teams. And forms are, again, just tools to guide the team, but it asks some of those same things. How many kids or what percentage of students are getting Tier 2? And then using some of those existing data sources to see if they're actually responding overall in those interventions, not just individual student response. So that's just another scaffolded example. The data tracking tool that just was reviewed from Monroe, it's a nice data source and way to do that in a Qualtrics system that allows teams to answer those questions. So we just want to wrap up with reminders of, you have 2 data systems that we've kind of referenced throughout, and I'm going to give you an example from PBIS to wrap us up. And keeping in mind that those are available to you. So as an active PBS school or PBS district, PBIS is the one most our district coordinators and school contacts are most familiar with. It's looking at those system fidelity tools and also for annual outcome data. So like that core report, our equity reports, our overall trends in discipline. That's available to you in PBIS that may help with some of the decision rules that we mentioned today. On the other side is RTIB. If you're not familiar, it is built to do things with student outcome data that we have talked about today. It was built with that intention and is free of use to districts. We put the links there if you want to explore those more. You can use it only for tier 2 or only for tier 3 or only for tier 1. Most of our districts like to try to use it for all 3 so that it gives you all the features that it possibly can. But that is particular to student outcome data. So the graphs that you saw, decisions to make with interventions, it is built to do that for you and available to you free of charge in Florida. PBIS that I mentioned on the left, that data system, one systems fidelity tool that we didn't want to leave without mentioning in terms of, is our system working for us? This tool is used in our training, just like the benchmarks of quality tool is used in tier 1 framework training. And tier 2 systems, we use the TFI tool, and it's broken into teaming considerations, evidence-based interventions, and evaluation. So if you are from a school and have completed that, it would be at the end of the year and be in PBIS as far as results. And you'll get graphs that are disaggregated by those areas that you can look at strengths and weaknesses, or areas that you might want to, strengths and weaknesses and areas that you might want to target for improvement. The other measure that everyone just completed for a mid-year quick check or progress monitoring check is our PBIS implementation checklist. And it, unlike the BOQ looks at tier 1, the PIC asks for a quick check across tiers. So you did just report on some tier 2 features that you could look at as far as how are we doing at the school level. Or if you're a district coordinator at this level, you can look across schools for trends in elementary schools, middles, or high. So we wanted to quickly reference those in terms of evaluating your system as things that can help. I already mentioned RTIB. We just didn't want to leave you without a reference to what it will do for you at tier 2. And then that live binder link that we keep mentioning for you, we put in here probably 3 times. But if you want to come back to any of the resources we mentioned, including that DPR that Stephanie mentioned, that's a nice example from middle school, they're all included in that live binder. And we also have recorded chats by each section if you wanted to reference those. Okay, great. Well, that is it. And I want to thank you from Stephanie and I for joining us this afternoon. And if you have additional questions or more things that you'd like to kind of know some more about, please feel free to chat in the chat box or reach out to your TA contact for your district or schools, the school within your district, so that we can give you any more information. This is our contact information on the screen. So thank you so much for joining us.